Break Your Comfort Zone. Written and published by Rising Audiobook. Introduction. What if the life you call safe is actually the reason you feel stuck, tired, and quietly unfulfilled? Not because you are incapable, but because comfort has slowly done its work, softly, silently, and consistently. It doesn't destroy you in a moment. It removes your hunger first, then your urgency, then your belief that something more is possible. And one day, without even realizing it, you stop reaching. Most people are not failing in life. They are settling too early. They confuse familiarity with progress and routine with purpose. The mind becomes an expert at protecting comfort, even when that comfort is quietly shrinking their potential. It creates reasons, logic, and excuses that sound reasonable, but lead nowhere new. Yet growth has never been found inside comfort. It always begins at the edge of discomfort, where certainty disappears and challenge begins. And this is where the real question lives. Not can I change, but am I willing to feel uncomfortable long enough to change? Because deep down you already know the truth. You say, I'm fine where I am, but inside something quieter tells you, you stopped growing a long time ago. And before you move on, don't rush past this. What follows might challenge you, unsettle you, and push you, but it may also be exactly what pulls you out of the life you've been quietly tolerating. Stay until the end, because the version of you you've been avoiding might finally make sense. Chapter 1. The Prison That Feels Like Home. There is a strange kind of silence that lives inside a life built on routine. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of repetition, where every day feels slightly familiar, slightly predictable, and slightly easier than questioning anything at all. At first, that feeling is comforting. It gives structure, direction, and the illusion of stability. But over time, what once felt like safety slowly begins to feel like stillness. And stillness, when it lasts too long, stops being restful. It starts becoming a wall. This is how comfort works. It rarely announces itself as limitation. Instead, it disguises itself as normal life. You wake up, follow the same patterns, think the same thoughts, avoid the same risks, and call it balance. Nothing feels wrong on the surface, so you stop looking deeper. And that is exactly how comfort becomes invisible. Not because it disappears, but because it blends in with everything you do. The most dangerous part is not that life becomes small. It is that you stop noticing it becoming small. Repetition has a quiet power. It does not just shape your schedule, it shapes your emotions. Over time, your mind begins to depend on familiarity, the way a tired traveler depends on an old road. Even if that road leads nowhere new, it feels easier to walk it again than to search for another path. And without realizing it, safety begins to replace ambition. You no longer ask, what else is possible for me? Instead, you start asking, what is least risky? Your decisions become less about growth and more about avoidance. Avoiding discomfort, avoiding failure, avoiding uncertainty. And slowly, avoidance starts to feel like wisdom. But something inside you never fully agrees with this life. There are moments, small, quiet moments, when you feel a strange discomfort you cannot explain. Not sadness exactly, not anger either. Something in between. A subtle awareness that you are living inside a pattern that no longer challenges you. Yet instead of questioning it, you push that feeling away, because questioning would mean change, and change would mean stepping outside what feels safe. So you stay, not because you are forced to, but because familiarity has a way of convincing you that staying is the same as being stable. You begin to mistake emotional comfort for direction. You begin to believe that as long as nothing is falling apart, everything must be fine. But fine is not the same as alive. There is a quiet moment in every life where a person stops exploring their own potential, not because the potential is gone, but because curiosity fades. And when curiosity fades, life becomes maintenance instead of movement. You no longer build your days, you manage them. You no longer grow, you repeat. You no longer question, you comply. It is not dramatic. it does not happen overnight. There is no single moment where you realize, I am trapped. Instead, it happens slowly, through comfort so consistent that you stop recognizing it as a choice. That is why this kind of prison is so powerful. It does not feel like confinement. It feels like home, like staying in a small room with open doors, but never walking out because the room feels familiar. And maybe that is the most uncomfortable truth of all. Nothing is physically holding you in place, not the world, not circumstances, not even time. It is something quieter, something internal, a learned preference for the known over the unknown, a habit of choosing comfort over curiosity. But the moment you begin to notice this pattern, something changes. Not outside immediately, but inside. Because awareness is the first crack in any invisible prison. You start to see that what felt like stability might have been stagnation, what felt like comfort might have been limitation, and what felt like enough might have been simply what you settled for without realizing it. This is where the story of change begins, not in action, but in recognition. The recognition that comfort has been shaping your life more than you have been shaping it. And once you see it clearly, you can no longer unsee it. The door has always been open. The question is whether you are willing to stop calling the room your entire world. Chapter 2. The life you never questioned enough. Before you knew who you were, the world was already telling you who to become. It started quietly. As a child, you learned what success looked like by watching the people around you. You learned what was realistic, what was safe, what was acceptable. Nobody sat you down and said, stop dreaming. It happened in smaller ways, through expectations, through routines, through the invisible pressure to fit into a life that already existed before you even had the chance to question it. Go to school, get good grades, find stability, stay practical, don't take too many risks, be responsible, follow the path, and so you did. Not because you deeply chose that life, but because it was the life everyone around you called normal. Like millions of others, you inherited a blueprint before you ever designed one for yourself. That is the strange thing about society. It rewards acceptance far more than questioning. People are praised for fitting in long before they are encouraged to think independently. The person who follows the expected path is considered mature. The person who questions it is often called unrealistic, reckless, or confused. Over time, this shapes more than your decisions. It shapes your imagination. You stop asking yourself what you truly want, because survival inside the system becomes your main focus. You become so busy maintaining life that you forget to examine it. Days turn into routines, routines turn into years, and eventually the unfamiliar begins to feel dangerous, not because it actually is, but because you lost the habit of exploring anything outside what you already know. Curiosity slowly fades when every day becomes repetition, and that is how people wake up one day feeling disconnected from their own lives without understanding why. On paper, everything may look acceptable. The responsibilities are handled, the schedule is full, the life appears stable, yet internally something feels absent, something deeper than motivation, because the human spirit was never designed only to repeat. It was designed to explore, create, evolve, and question. When that part of you is ignored for too long, life begins to feel emotionally flat, not painful enough to force change, but empty enough to quietly drain your energy. The hardest part is that most people never pause long enough to investigate this feeling. They distract themselves from it. They call it stress, exhaustion, or adulthood. They normalize emotional disconnection because everyone around them seems disconnected too, and so the cycle continues. You never chose your path, you simply followed what everyone around you called life. But there comes a moment, sometimes small and almost invisible, where awareness begins. It may happen late at night when the noise finally disappears. It may happen while watching someone else live boldly in a way you secretly wish you could. Or maybe it happens after another ordinary day leaves you feeling strangely incomplete. That moment matters more than most people realize, because awareness is dangerous to the life you have been unconsciously repeating. The moment you begin questioning what once felt normal, the illusion starts weakening. You begin noticing how many of your beliefs were inherited rather than discovered, how many of your fears were learned from others, how many limitations were accepted without evidence. You start realizing that normal is not always healthy, common is not always meaningful, and stability without growth can become another form of emotional imprisonment. This realization can feel uncomfortable at first. Questioning your life creates uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens the identity you spent years building. Part of you will want to retreat back into routine because routine feels predictable. Predictable feels safe. But another part of you, the part that still wants more, begins waking up. For the first time in a long time, you stop moving automatically. You begin observing yourself, your habits, your excuses, your fears, your environment. You begin asking questions you avoided before. Is this truly the life I want? Or is this simply the life I adapted to? That question changes everything, because the moment a person starts thinking consciously, they stop being completely controlled by the patterns around them. Awareness creates distance between you and the life you inherited. It gives you the ability to decide instead of simply react, and that is where transformation truly begins. Not with dramatic action, but with honest recognition. Recognition that you may have spent years climbing a ladder you never personally chose. Recognition that comfort and familiarity may have shaped your decisions more than purpose ever did. Recognition that the life you accepted without question might not be the life meant for you at all. Most people spend their entire lives asleep inside routines they never challenged. But the moment you begin questioning normal, you take the first real step toward freedom. Because a different life does not begin when circumstances change. It begins the moment you finally dare to think for yourself. Chapter 3. The pain you avoid is the life you want. Every person has a silent negotiation happening inside them every single day. Wake up early or stay in bed. Speak up or remain quiet. Take the risk or protect what is familiar. Start now or wait for the right time. Most of these moments seem small while they are happening, almost insignificant, but hidden inside them is the direction of your entire life. Because the truth is, the life you want is usually hiding behind the discomfort you keep avoiding. That is why growth feels so difficult. Not because you are incapable, but because growth and discomfort have always been connected. Every meaningful transformation asks something uncomfortable from you first. Discipline before confidence, rejection before belonging, failure before mastery, uncertainty before freedom. Yet most people spend their lives trying to avoid discomfort, as if discomfort itself is the enemy. They avoid hard conversations and lose real connection. They avoid taking risks and lose possibility. They avoid temporary struggle and slowly build permanent regret. In trying to escape pain, they unknowingly walk directly toward another kind of suffering, the suffering of staying the same. And that pain is quieter but heavier. It is the pain of potential left unused. The pain of wondering who you could have become if fear had not controlled your decisions. The pain of watching time move forward while your life stays emotionally parked in the same place. Avoidance always feels good in the moment. That is why it becomes addictive. Skipping the difficult task creates temporary relief. Delaying the decision creates temporary comfort. Staying inside familiar habits protects you from immediate discomfort. But comfort charges interest. What feels easy today often becomes painful tomorrow. The workout you keep skipping becomes the body you no longer recognize. The dream you postpone becomes the regret you carry for years. The conversation you avoid becomes the distance you cannot repair. The opportunity you fear becomes the memory that quietly haunts you later. Life has a strange pattern. The discomfort we avoid early usually returns with greater weight later. But there is another side to this truth. Discomfort is not always a warning sign. Sometimes it is a direction sign. Sometimes the nervousness you feel is not danger, it is growth, trying to enter your life. Think about the moments that changed you most. Very few of them were comfortable while they were happening. Starting something new, walking away from what no longer served you, speaking honestly, facing failure, trying again after disappointment. None of it felt safe, but those moments shaped you more than the comfortable ones ever did, because discomfort stretches your identity. It forces you to meet parts of yourself you never would have discovered inside ease. The problem is that most people misunderstand discomfort. They assume that because something feels difficult, it must be wrong. But difficulty is often the price of expansion. Your old self resists growth because growth threatens familiarity. The mind wants certainty, even when certainty is keeping you small. So every time you move toward something meaningful, resistance appears, not because you are incapable of the journey, but because transformation requires friction. A seed breaks before it grows, muscles tear before they strengthen, old identities collapse before new ones are formed. Nature itself teaches this principle constantly. Growth is rarely comfortable while it is happening, and maybe this is the realization that changes everything. The goal is not to eliminate discomfort from your life. The goal is to choose the discomfort that leads somewhere meaningful. There is discomfort in discipline, and there is discomfort in regret, discomfort in taking risks, and discomfort in staying stuck, discomfort in growth, and discomfort in never becoming who you know you could be. One creates transformation, the other creates emptiness. At some point you must decide which pain you are willing to live with, because the uncomfortable action you keep delaying may actually be the doorway to the life you keep imagining. The thing you fear most may contain the exact growth you need most, and the version of you are trying to become is not waiting on the other side of comfort. It is waiting on the other side of courage. Not perfect courage, not fearless courage, just the willingness to step toward discomfort instead of running from it. And once you understand this, your relationship with pain begins to change. You stop seeing discomfort as proof that you are failing. You begin seeing it as proof that you are moving forward. Chapter 4. Excuses. The stories that keep you asleep. Listen carefully to the way people explain their lives, and you will often hear something deeper than facts. You will hear protection. I'll start when things calm down. I'm just not the confident type. It's too late for me now. I don't really have time. Most excuses do not sound emotional when spoken out loud. They sound practical, reasonable, even intelligent. That is what makes them dangerous. Excuses rarely arrive looking like fear. They arrive disguised as logic. And over time, those stories become invisible truths we stop questioning. The human mind has a powerful instinct. It wants to protect the identity you already know, even if that identity is limiting your growth. Because growth threatens familiarity, and familiarity feels safe. So when you stand near change, real change, your mind immediately begins searching for reasons to retreat. Not because you are weak, but because the brain interprets uncertainty as danger. That is why excuses are often emotional at their core, even when they sound rational on the surface. The excuse itself is usually not the real issue. Beneath it lives something quieter: fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of discomfort, fear of becoming responsible for your own potential. Sometimes people say they are waiting for the right moment, when in reality they are waiting to stop feeling afraid. But that moment never arrives, because courage was never the absence of fear. It was the decision to move while fear was still present. Excuses delay that decision, and the longer they are repeated, the more believable they become. A person who dreams of changing their life may spend years explaining why now is not the time. They analyze endlessly, plan endlessly, hesitate endlessly. Meanwhile, life continues moving. Days become months, months become years, and eventually the excuse hardens into identity. This is just who I am. But most identities are not discovered. They are repeated. That is why rationalization is so powerful. It allows people to protect their comfort while convincing themselves they are simply being realistic. It creates emotional permission to stay the same. I don't have time, but often what that really means is, it's not important enough to me yet, because people somehow find time for what emotionally matters to them. They find time for distractions, entertainment, scrolling, avoidance, and habits that keep them comfortable. The issue is rarely time itself. The issue is emotional priority, and this realization can be uncomfortable, because it removes the illusion. It forces honesty. Excuses survive best in vagueness. The moment you become brutally honest with yourself, many of them begin collapsing. I'm too old. Or are you afraid to begin again? I'm waiting for confidence. Or are you avoiding the possibility of embarrassment? I need more preparation. Or are you terrified of failing publicly? These questions are difficult because they expose something most people spend years hiding from themselves. Comfort is often defended through storytelling. The mind creates narratives to justify remaining in familiar territory, and the more emotionally attached you become to those stories, the harder it becomes to recognize them as self-protection instead of truth. But eventually, a painful realization appears. Your excuses may protect you from temporary discomfort, but they also protect you from transformation. Every excuse builds a wall between who you are and who you could become. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, one delay at a time, one rationalization at a time, one avoided decision at a time. And perhaps the saddest part is that many people genuinely believe their own stories. They no longer recognize the difference between limitation and fear. The excuse becomes their reality because they have repeated it for so long. But deep inside, something usually knows the truth, that quiet inner voice that appears late at night, the one that whispers, "You are capable of more than this." That voice never fully disappears. You can distract yourself from it, silence it temporarily, bury it beneath routine. But somewhere beneath the excuses, beneath the fear, beneath the carefully constructed explanations, there remains a version of you that knows you have been playing smaller than you truly are. And the moment you stop defending your limitations, your life begins changing. Not instantly, not dramatically, but honestly, because real growth starts with self-confrontation. The willingness to look at your own patterns without pretending. The courage to admit that some of the barriers in your life are no longer external. They are internal habits of thinking. That awareness changes everything. You stop asking, "What excuse can protect my comfort?" and start asking, "What truth can change my life?" That shift is uncomfortable, but it is also freeing, because once you see your excuses clearly, they lose some of their power over you. The stories that once kept you asleep no longer feel convincing, and for the first time in a long time, you begin hearing something more powerful than fear. Responsibility, not as punishment, but as freedom. Because the moment you stop explaining why you cannot change, you finally create space to begin. Chapter 5. The Fear Line, where most people turn back. Not every step forward feels like progress. Some steps feel like resistance, like something inside you is pushing back, not to punish you, but to test whether you are serious about changing your life or just dreaming comfortably about it. This is the point most people never talk about, the quiet edge between effort and escape. The fear line, it does not announce itself with clarity. It does not come with instructions or warnings. Instead, it shows up as hesitation, as doubt that feels strangely logical, as fatigue that appears right when you are closest to doing something meaningful. It is subtle, but powerful enough to change the direction of an entire life. Every goal has this point, a breaking point of resistance where everything in you begins to question whether you should continue, not because you are incapable, but because growth always demands more from you than comfort ever did. At first, starting something new feels exciting. You imagine progress, success, change, your mind is open, your energy is high, and everything feels possible. But as you move forward, reality begins to add weight to the journey. The effort becomes real, the uncertainty becomes visible, the results are not immediate, and then without warning, resistance appears. This is where fear intensifies, not at the beginning, not at the end, but right before breakthrough. It is almost as if life places a final test at the exact moment you are closest to transformation. The same work that once felt inspiring suddenly feels heavy. The same goal that once felt exciting now feels uncertain. The same path that once felt full of possibility now feels like it might not be worth it. And in that moment, the mind begins its quiet negotiation. Maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I should slow down. Maybe I was wrong about this. But what feels like doubt is often not truth. It is pressure. The pressure of change pushing against the version of you that still wants to remain safe, because every meaningful goal challenges who you currently are. And the fear line is where that challenge becomes undeniable. Most people do not fail at the beginning of their journey. They do not fail because they lack talent or opportunity. They fail at this exact point, the moment when effort stops feeling exciting and starts feeling uncomfortable. They stop just before results appear. Not because results are far, but because resistance feels too close. It is one of the most silent tragedies in personal growth. People walking away from the exact moment their life was about to shift. Because from the outside, nothing looks special at this stage. There is no visible reward yet. No proof that continuing will work. Only repetition, only uncertainty, only effort without immediate return. And that is where patience becomes more important than intensity. Because intensity starts the journey, but patience finishes it. The fear line is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that you are doing something real. Anything meaningful in life carries this phase. Whether it is building a skill, changing your habits, starting a business, improving your health, or rebuilding yourself mentally, there will always be a moment where quitting feels easier than continuing. And in that moment, fear becomes loud. Not because you are in danger, but because you are close to change. Courage, then, is not a feeling. It is a decision made at the edge of discomfort. It is choosing action when hesitation feels more reasonable. It is continuing when stopping would bring immediate relief. It is staying present in the moment where your old identity is trying to convince you to turn back. Because your old identity does not disappear quietly. It resists, it argues, it creates fear in the shape of logic. It tells you that comfort is safer than growth, even when comfort is exactly what kept you stuck. But something powerful happens when you stay, when you do not retreat at the fear line, even though every instinct tells you to. The fear does not grow stronger. It begins to lose authority. What once felt overwhelming starts to feel manageable. What once felt uncertain starts to feel familiar. And what once felt like a breaking point becomes a turning point. This is where most people never stay long enough to see what happens next. Because beyond the fear line is something very simple, but life-changing, momentum. Not instant success, not sudden transformation, but the first signs that your effort is beginning to move in your favor. The beginning of clarity. The beginning of confidence that is no longer imagined but experienced. And slowly you realize something that changes how you see everything. Fear was never a stop sign. It was a threshold. A signal that you are no longer in the safe territory of repetition, but in the uncertain territory of growth. And every time you choose to cross it instead of retreating, you stop becoming someone who avoids life and start becoming someone who moves through it. Chapter 6. The discipline of doing what you avoid. There is a quiet truth most people never fully accept about their lives. You are not shaped by what you intend to do. You are shaped by what you repeatedly avoid. Every day there are small tasks, decisions, and responsibilities you delay. Not because they are impossible, but because they carry resistance, a feeling, a discomfort, a slight emotional weight that makes you postpone them for later. And in that delay, something subtle happens. You don't just avoid the task, you strengthen the habit of avoidance itself. Discipline is often misunderstood as a burst of motivation, a surge of energy, or a moment of inspiration that pushes you into action. But real discipline is far less dramatic. It is quieter, less emotional, more mechanical in the beginning. Discipline is built through repetition, not motivation. Motivation rises and falls like weather. Some days it is strong, other days it disappears completely. But your life does not pause for your motivation. Time continues, responsibilities continue, opportunities continue moving forward, whether you participate or not. So the people who eventually change their lives are not the ones who feel motivated the most. They are the ones who learn how to act even when motivation is absent. And this is where something powerful begins to unfold. Every time you avoid something important, you are not saving energy, you are training resistance. The task does not disappear, it simply gains emotional weight in your mind. Tomorrow it feels heavier, next week it feels even heavier, and eventually, what was once a small action becomes something you dread. Avoidance strengthens weakness over time, but action works in the opposite direction. Action reduces emotional resistance. The moment you begin what you were avoiding, something inside you starts to shift. The fear is still there, but it loses authority. The discomfort still exists, but it becomes manageable. And once you complete the task, even imperfectly, the emotional pressure around it decreases. This is how discipline is actually built, not by eliminating discomfort, but by repeatedly moving through it. Most people imagine discipline as a personality trait, something you either have or you don't. But discipline is not identity, it is a system of repeated actions that slowly reshape your internal responses. And systems always beat willpower. Willpower is unstable, it depends on energy, mood and circumstances, but systems remove decision-making from emotional states. They turn action into structure. For example, instead of asking yourself every day whether you feel like doing something difficult, you create a pattern where it happens regardless of how you feel. That is where transformation begins, because the real problem is not that tasks are difficult. The real problem is that your mind has learned to negotiate with difficulty. I'll do it later. Let me wait until I feel ready. I'll start tomorrow. Each of these thoughts seems harmless in isolation, but together they build a pattern of delay that slowly erodes your potential. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but consistently. And over time, your life begins to reflect what you avoided more than what you attempted. But something interesting happens when you finally decide to stop negotiating with yourself. At first, resistance increases. The mind pushes back harder because it is losing control over its usual patterns. The same task you avoided suddenly feels even more uncomfortable when you begin doing it consistently. This is the transition phase, the point where old habits fight for survival. But if you continue, something changes. The emotional weight begins to decrease. What once felt heavy starts feeling normal. What once felt overwhelming starts feeling manageable. And what once felt impossible starts feeling routine. This is the hidden reward of discipline. It does not just help you complete tasks, it changes how those tasks feel to you. Consider something simple, a task you currently avoid. Maybe it is studying, working out, starting a project, or having an uncomfortable conversation. The longer you avoid it, the more power it seems to have over you. It grows in your imagination. It becomes larger than it actually is. But the moment you do it, even once, you realize something important. It was never as powerful as your avoidance made it seem. And this realization is life-changing, because now you understand that most of your limitations were not real limitations. They were emotional interpretations of discomfort. Discipline breaks that illusion. There is a specific shift that happens when you begin consistently doing what you avoid. It does not feel like sudden success. It feels like quiet control. You start trusting yourself more, not because everything becomes easy, but because you stop abandoning yourself when things become difficult. And self-trust is one of the strongest foundations of winning in life. Without it, every challenge feels overwhelming. With it, challenges become structured problems to solve. This is why systems matter more than inspiration. A system removes emotional debate. It removes hesitation. It removes the mental argument of should I or shouldn't I, and replaces it with a simple structure. This is what I do, regardless of how I feel. For example, imagine starting your day by doing the task you usually avoid the most, not scrolling, not delaying, not preparing endlessly, but doing it immediately. First, before your mind builds resistance. At first it feels uncomfortable, even unfair. But slowly, something begins to shift. The task loses its emotional dominance. You are no longer negotiating with it. You are simply completing it. And that is where freedom begins. Because discipline is not restriction, it is liberation from emotional control. It is the ability to act without needing perfect conditions inside your mind. Over time, something subtle but powerful happens. The version of you that used to avoid everything difficult begins to weaken, and a new version begins to emerge. The one who acts first, thinks later. The one who understands that discomfort is not a signal to stop, but a signal to begin. You stop waiting for motivation because you no longer need it. You stop avoiding tasks because avoidance no longer defines your behavior. And most importantly, you stop identifying as someone who struggles with discipline. Instead, discipline becomes how you live. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but consistently. And consistency, more than anything else, is what turns ordinary effort into extraordinary results. Because in the end, your life is not transformed by what you do occasionally. It is transformed by what you are willing to do repeatedly, even when you don't feel like it. Chapter 7. Small actions, massive transformation. It rarely begins in a way that feels important. There is no dramatic moment, no loud decision, no instant shift where life suddenly feels different. In fact, most transformation begins so quietly that you almost ignore it at first. A small choice, a short action, a decision so minor that it feels almost insignificant in the moment. And that is exactly why most people underestimate it. Because the human mind is wired to recognize dramatic change, not subtle repetition. We expect transformation to feel big while it is happening, but real change almost never announces itself early. It hides inside ordinary actions that repeat long before results appear. This is the hidden truth behind every success you admire. It was not built in a moment of inspiration, but in a sequence of small actions repeated when no one was watching, and often when even the person doing them did not fully believe in the outcome yet. Tiny, consistent actions compound over time, just like water slowly shaping stone, not through force but through repetition. One drop means nothing. 100 drops seem minor, but over time, the impact becomes undeniable. Not because the force increased, but because the consistency never stopped. Your life works the same way. Every small action you take is either reinforcing the direction you want or silently strengthening the direction you don't. And the strange part is that progress is often invisible at first. You do not feel it immediately. You do not see it clearly. There is no instant reward system telling you that something is changing. In the beginning, it often feels like nothing is happening at all. This is where most people quit. They expect early evidence of transformation, and when they don't see it, they assume their effort is wasted. But what they cannot see is that beneath the surface, something important is forming. Neural patterns are shifting, habits are stabilizing, identity is slowly adjusting to a new rhythm. Because every repeated action is not just building a result, it is building a version of you. Identity shifts through small repeated wins, not through declarations, not through motivation, but through evidence collected quietly over time. Each time you follow through on something small, you send a message to yourself. I am someone who acts. I am someone who follows through. I am someone who does not abandon effort when it feels inconvenient. And those messages accumulate. At first they feel small, almost unnoticeable, but over time they begin to shape how you see yourself. And once your identity shifts, your behavior begins to follow it naturally. This is why discipline does not usually feel dramatic in the beginning. It is not a sudden burst of strength. It is a quiet repetition of actions that slowly become easier because your resistance to them decreases over time. Discipline grows quietly, not dramatically. Most people imagine discipline as something intense, something that requires constant struggle and emotional force, but real discipline is often calm. It is the decision to do something small today, and then doing it again tomorrow, and then again the next day, even when nothing external is pushing you. The power is not in the size of the action. The power is in the continuity, because when something is repeated long enough, it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like identity. Think about learning a skill. At the beginning, even 10 minutes feels difficult. Your mind resists. Focus is unstable. Progress feels slow. You might even wonder if it is worth continuing. But if you stay consistent, something subtle begins to change. The same 10 minutes that once felt heavy becomes normal, and what once felt impossible starts becoming manageable. Then it becomes familiar, and eventually it becomes part of who you are. 10 minutes daily of focused work becomes a completely new skill within months. Not because those 10 minutes were powerful on their own, but because they were repeated without interruption long enough to compound into something greater than their individual value. And this is where most people miss the real nature of transformation. They overestimate what needs to be done in a single day and underestimate what can be built in small, consistent effort over time. They wait for motivation to create big change, instead of trusting repetition to create lasting change. But life does not transform through intensity alone. It transforms through accumulation. A single workout does not change the body. A single study session does not create mastery. A single productive day does not create success. But repeated small actions, aligned in the same direction, eventually become undeniable progress, and the most powerful part of this process is that it does not require perfection. It only requires continuation. Even imperfect effort, repeated consistently, has the ability to reshape identity and outcomes, because your brain does not measure transformation by intensity. It measures it by repetition. Every time you show up, even slightly, you are reinforcing a new version of yourself. And slowly, without dramatic moments, without sudden breakthroughs, without external validation, you begin to notice something surprising. You are no longer the person who struggles to start. You are the person who continues. And that shift does not feel like a victory in the moment. It feels like a quiet realization that you are no longer where you used to be. Not because life changed overnight, but because you did, one small action at a time. Chapter 8. The Identity Built Through Repetition. A person does not wake up one morning and suddenly become different. There is no clear moment where the mind clicks and announces, "From today you are a new version of yourself." Instead, change arrives quietly, almost invisibly, through something far less dramatic but far more powerful. Repetition. Not the kind that feels exciting, not the kind that is celebrated or noticed, but the kind that happens in ordinary moments, when no one is watching, when motivation is low, and when choices feel small enough to ignore. Because identity is not created in big decisions, it is created in repeated ones. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you are becoming. And most people do not realize this while it is happening. They think identity is something they declare, something they hope for, something they will eventually step into when life feels ready. But life does not respond to intention alone. It responds to behavior. You become what you repeatedly do, not what you repeatedly imagine. And this is where transformation quietly begins, not in ambition, but in repetition. At first, your actions feel separate from your identity. You are simply trying things, testing habits, attempting change. There is still a gap between who you are and what you are doing. You might go to the gym, but still not feel like a fit person. You might study, but still not feel like a disciplined person. You might work hard, but still not feel like someone who is successful. And that is completely normal, because identity always lags behind behavior. The mind does not update instantly. It waits for evidence. It watches patterns. it collects data from your consistency. And only after enough repetition does it begin to shift its internal story about who you are. This is why small habits matter far more than they appear to in the moment. Small habits define long-term personality, not dramatic actions, not rare bursts of motivation, but the quiet things you do repeatedly without needing emotional energy every time. The way you respond to discomfort, the way you handle delay, the way you react when something is difficult but necessary. These small decisions accumulate, and over time, they build something much larger than behavior. They build self-perception. Because the brain does not separate what you do from who you are, it merges them. If you repeatedly avoid difficult tasks, your mind begins to define you as someone who avoids difficulty. If you repeatedly follow through, even in small ways, your mind begins to define you as someone who follows through. If you repeatedly delay, your identity becomes someone who delays. If you repeatedly act, your identity becomes someone who acts. Not because you declared it, but because you demonstrated it. This is the quiet mechanism behind all transformation. Identity follows behavior, not intention. And this truth can feel uncomfortable at first, because it removes the illusion that wanting something is enough. Many people spend years wanting change, hoping for change, thinking about change, but their daily behavior remains unchanged. And life always listens to behavior more than hope. This is why two people with the same desire can end up in completely different realities. One person thinks about discipline but continues avoiding discomfort. The other feels resistance but still takes small action anyway. Over time, the gap between them widens, not because of talent, but because of repetition. Because repetition compounds. Just like interest in a bank account, small actions accumulate into large outcomes. But the real accumulation is not only external, it is internal. You are not just building results. You are building identity. And every time you complete a task you wanted to avoid, you are not just getting something done. You are reinforcing a version of yourself that does not retreat easily. Every time you show up when it is inconvenient, you are not just being productive. You are reshaping how you see yourself. And slowly, something begins to shift. At first, discipline feels like effort. Then it becomes routine. Then it becomes expected. And eventually, it becomes natural. Not because the difficulty disappeared, but because your identity adapted to it. This is how people transform without even realizing the exact moment it happened. There is no single breakthrough, no dramatic shift, just a long sequence of small repeated actions that gradually redefine who they are. You don't become fit once, you become fit by acting like a fit person every day. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but consistently, and that consistency begins to overwrite your old identity. The version of you that once hesitated starts to weaken. Not because you forced it away, but because you stopped feeding it with repetition. Meanwhile, a new version of you begins to form. Not in imagination, but in action. And at some point something subtle but powerful happens. You stop saying, "I am trying to be this person," and start realizing, "This is who I am becoming." That shift is everything, because once identity changes, behavior no longer feels like a struggle. It becomes alignment. You are no longer forcing yourself to act differently. You are simply continuing the pattern of who you already are. And this is where real stability begins. Not emotional stability. Identity stability. The kind that does not collapse every time motivation fades or circumstances change. Because identity built through repetition does not depend on feeling. It depends on evidence. And you are constantly providing that evidence through your actions. Even on days when effort feels heavy, even on days when progress feels slow, even on days when nothing seems to be changing, you are still shaping identity. That is the hidden truth most people miss. Nothing is wasted when repetition is present. Every small effort counts. Every small follow-through matters. Every small moment of discipline is another layer added to who you are becoming. And over time, those layers become unshakable. Because identity is not built in one moment. It is built in thousands of repeated ones. And one day, you look back and realize something quietly powerful. You are no longer fighting to become that person. You already are them, not because of intention, but because of repetition. Chapter 9. The moment you refuse to go back. Some decisions do not feel powerful when you make them. They feel quiet, almost ordinary. No celebration, no sudden shift in reality, no visible transformation in the world around you. And yet, internally, something irreversible begins to move. This is one of those decisions, the moment you refuse to go back. Not to a place, not to a situation, but to a version of yourself that no longer fits who you are becoming. At first, change often feels experimental. You try something new, step outside your comfort zone, attempt a different behavior, explore a new habit. But deep down, part of you still keeps the door open to return. Return to old routines, old responses, old patterns that feel familiar, even if they no longer feel right. This is how most transformation begins: fragile, reversible, uncertain. But real change does not become real until something shifts inside you, until going back stops feeling like an option. There comes a point in every personal journey where awareness deepens, not the kind of awareness that simply understands what needs to change, but the kind that begins to recognize what staying the same is costing you. And once you see that clearly, something subtle happens. The old life does not disappear, but it loses emotional control over you. Things that once pulled you back automatically begin to feel different. The comfort that once felt soothing now feels limiting. The habits that once felt harmless now feel draining. The distractions that once felt necessary now feel empty, not because they changed, but because you did. Awareness creates irreversible change, because once you truly see something, you cannot return to ignorance in the same way. Even if you temporarily fall back into old patterns, you do not experience them blindly anymore. There is a part of you watching, not judging, not resisting, just aware, and awareness changes everything. It creates distance between you and your automatic behavior. It interrupts the unconscious cycle of repetition. It introduces a new space where choice becomes possible instead of reaction. And in that space, something powerful begins to form. Commitment replaces hesitation, not the emotional kind of commitment that depends on motivation or inspiration, but the quiet kind, the kind that does not fluctuate with mood, the kind that does not require perfect conditions, the kind that begins when you realize that your life cannot keep circling the same outcomes forever. At this stage, something shifts in how you respond to yourself. Before hesitation had authority, a feeling of doubt could redirect your entire day. A moment of resistance could stop your progress completely. A return to comfort could happen without question, almost automatically. But now, hesitation loses power. It still appears, but it no longer decides. Instead of asking, "Should I go back to what is easier?" you begin asking a deeper question. What does going back actually cost me now? And that question is where transformation becomes stable, because once you begin to measure the cost of your old habits honestly, their emotional appeal starts to weaken. The comfort that once felt attractive begins to reveal its hidden weight. The patterns that once felt safe begin to show their limitations more clearly. You start noticing something you did not fully see before. Going back is not neutral. It always comes with a price. It costs momentum. It costs self-trust. It costs progress that is quietly building beneath the surface, even when you cannot see it yet. And when that realization settles in, something important changes internally. The emotional pull of the past begins to fade. Not suddenly, but steadily. And in its place, something else begins to grow. A quiet form of self-respect. Because every time you choose not to return to what once controlled you, you reinforce a new internal message: I am no longer the person who abandons myself. And that message, repeated enough times, becomes identity. The first time you say no to your old habits, your new identity begins forming. It may not feel dramatic. It may not feel life-changing in the moment. It might feel like a small refusal, a simple decision, a quiet moment where you choose differently than you used to. But internally, it is not small at all. It is the beginning of separation between who you were and who you are becoming, because every habit you refuse to return to weakens the identity that once depended on it, and every new action you repeat strengthens the identity that is replacing it. This is why transformation is rarely a single moment. It is a series of decisions where going back slowly becomes less and less appealing. At first you still feel the pull of old patterns. You still remember how easy it was to avoid discomfort. You still feel the temptation to delay, to escape, to retreat into familiarity. But something has changed now. You are no longer acting blindly. You are aware, and awareness makes repetition different. Before awareness, you repeat unconsciously. After awareness, you repeat consciously, or you interrupt the pattern entirely. And that interruption is where freedom begins. Because most people are not trapped by their circumstances. They are trapped by unconscious repetition. But the moment you begin to notice your patterns in real time, you gain the ability to choose differently, not perfectly, not instantly, but gradually, consistently, intentionally. And over time, something remarkable happens. The old version of you becomes less convincing, not because it disappears completely, but because it no longer feels aligned with what you now know about yourself. There is a shift in identity that does not announce itself loudly. It simply becomes harder to justify old behavior, harder to return without noticing, harder to repeat without awareness, and in that space commitment deepens, not as pressure, but as clarity. You are no longer fighting yourself every day. You are no longer debating who you should be. You are no longer constantly restarting from zero. Instead, you are building from continuity. Each decision not to go back becomes another layer of stability in your identity. Each moment of forward movement becomes another confirmation of who you are choosing to be. And slowly, something once fragile becomes solid. You stop seeing yourself as someone trying to change, and start recognizing yourself as someone who has already changed direction. Not perfectly, but permanently. Because once you refuse to go back long enough, something inside you locks into place. The past no longer feels like a place you belong. It becomes a reference point, a reminder of where you came from, not where you return to. And at that stage, transformation is no longer a struggle between old and new. It becomes a steady continuation of the new. You are no longer negotiating with your past. You are building your future. And that is the moment everything changes. Not because life becomes easier, but because you finally stop giving your old self permission to decide your direction. From here on, every step is forward. Not because you are forced, but because you have finally decided not to go back. Chapter 10. The Identity of Someone Who Doesn't Retreat. Silence after struggle is never empty. It is revealing. It shows you something most people spend their entire lives avoiding: who you become when things stop going your way. When motivation fades, when progress slows, when results are not guaranteed, when comfort is no longer available as an escape. In those moments, your real identity begins to speak. Not the identity you talk about, not the identity you hope for, but the one you have been building through your responses to difficulty. Most people believe they are defined by their goals, but in reality, they are defined by how they behave when those goals become uncomfortable to pursue. Because anyone can move forward when life feels easy. Anyone can stay committed when progress is visible. Anyone can feel confident when everything is working in their favor. But identity is not formed in easy moments. It is formed when life resists you and you respond. The identity of someone who doesn't retreat is not created overnight. It is not a personality trait you are born with. It is built slowly, through repeated decisions to stay in motion, even when every instinct suggests stopping. At first, growth feels deliberate. You have to force yourself into action. You have to push through hesitation. You have to override internal resistance. Every step forward feels like effort. But something subtle begins to change over time. growth becomes your default response. Not because difficulty disappears, but because your relationship with difficulty changes. Instead of seeing challenges as signals to withdraw, you begin seeing them as signals to engage. The same situation that once made you hesitate now activates something inside you. You stop asking, "How do I escape this?" and start asking, "How do I move through this?" That shift is not external, it is internal rewiring. Challenges no longer intimidate, they activate you. This is the point where transformation becomes visible, not in outcomes, but in reactions. The things that used to shake your confidence begin to sharpen your focus. Pressure stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like direction. Uncertainty stops feeling like danger and starts feeling like space to grow. You begin noticing something unusual. The situations that once discouraged you now demand your presence instead of your avoidance. And slowly your identity starts separating from your old patterns. Setbacks become training, not failure. This is one of the deepest turning points in personal transformation. Because as long as setbacks feel like failure, they carry emotional weight that pushes you backward. They become evidence for quitting. They become justification for retreat. But when your identity shifts, setbacks lose their emotional authority. You stop interpreting them as signs that you are not capable and start interpreting them as part of capability being built. A mistake is no longer a reason to stop. It becomes information. A delay is no longer a reason to doubt yourself. It becomes adjustment. A difficult phase is no longer a signal of weakness. It becomes resistance training for your discipline. And once this shift happens, something powerful becomes clear. Progress was never meant to be linear. It was meant to be built through resistance. The identity of someone who doesn't retreat is not someone who never struggles. It is someone who no longer uses struggle as an exit point. Instead of quitting when life gets hard, you adjust and move forward stronger. That adjustment is the real skill. Not perfection, not constant success, but adaptability under pressure. The ability to stay in motion while life is still unstable. The ability to continue even when clarity is incomplete. Because life rarely offers perfect conditions, it offers resistance. And identity is revealed in how you respond to that resistance. At some point, you stop treating discomfort as something that needs to be eliminated before you act. You begin to see it as something that travels with action. You realize that waiting for discomfort to disappear is just another form of delay. So you stop waiting. You start using discomfort as a signal that you are doing something meaningful. And this is where your internal world begins to stabilize in a new way. Not because life becomes easier, but because your reaction to life becomes consistent. You are no longer negotiating with your emotions every time something becomes difficult. You are no longer debating whether to continue based on how you feel in the moment. You are operating from something deeper than feeling. You are operating from identity, and identity is powerful because it removes constant decision fatigue. You are no longer deciding who you should be every day. You are expressing who you have repeatedly become. That expression begins quietly, in small moments, in decisions no one sees, in responses to pressure that no one notices. But over time, those small expressions compound, and eventually something shifts that you cannot ignore. You begin to trust yourself differently, not because everything is easy, but because you no longer abandon yourself when things are difficult. That self-trust becomes the foundation of a new kind of stability, a stability that is not dependent on circumstances, but on character. And from that foundation, something new emerges. You stop identifying as someone who tries to improve, and start identifying as someone who continues, regardless of difficulty. That identity does not mean life stops being challenging. It means challenges stop defining your direction. You are no longer someone who retreats when pressure increases. You are someone who advances through it. And once that becomes your default response, everything changes, not all at once, but permanently. Because the moment you stop retreating from life, life stops controlling your limits. And what remains is not just progress. It is a new identity built through every moment you chose to continue when quitting would have been easier. Somewhere along this journey, something inside you stopped being the same. Not suddenly, not loudly, but quietly. Through every moment you chose awareness over avoidance, action over delay, and discomfort over escape. The version of you that once hesitated before everything begins to feel distant now, not gone, but no longer in control. You are no longer the person who avoids discomfort. That identity no longer fits the way it once did. What used to feel threatening now feels familiar. What used to stop you now simply passes through you without the same power. Growth is no longer something you chase. It is something you live. A continuous identity shaped not by occasional effort, but by consistent return to what challenges you. You no longer wait for perfect conditions to move forward. You create movement inside imperfect ones. Comfort loses its authority when you stop negotiating with it. It no longer decides your direction. It no longer dictates your choices. It becomes something you notice, not something you obey. And slowly, life stops feeling like something happening to you. It becomes something you are actively shaping. Every decision, every response, every moment of resistance becomes part of a larger pattern, one where you are no longer reacting from old habits, but responding from a stronger identity. This is the shift most people never reach. Not because it is impossible, but because it requires leaving behind the version of yourself that once felt safe. But you have already started doing that. You didn't just break your comfort zone. You rewrote who you are. And once that shift happens, there is no going back, only forward.